Hi, everyone. I present a lot better with a beer, so I'll just keep it close. All right. So what I want to talk about tonight is the transformation we're going through at Telus to go from what we call, it's a beautiful way to call it, the classic testing to Agile testing. We are a fairly large organization. We have about 30,000 people in Canada. We do a lot of software development. We do a lot of outsourcing. We have a lot of third-party applications that we bring on. In total, in IT, or business transformation, which is our group, we have about 1,200 applications. And it spans all technologies, from C to mainframe to Java. And we're mostly a Java shop right now, but it spans quite a lot. Over the last, 100 years, since Telus has existed, and before it was BC Tel and whatever they were called before that, we've been developing more and more applications. And a lot of what Telus does today, and a lot of the systems we have been built on systems that have been integrated over the years. So in the late 98 or 99, when we merged BC Tel with AGT, we started integrating the mainframe we had in Alberta with the mainframe we had in BC. So you can imagine what some of it looks like right now. We have multiple systems even to do the same thing across Alberta, BC, Ontario, Quebec. Because, like I said, we grew based on acquisitions. So why is that important? Is when I get to Agile testing, I'll talk a little bit about how that plays into how you transform an organization. And hopefully it will give you a bit of an insight on what it's like to go and take a large organization like Telus with 3,000 people in IT, 30,000 people, 1,200 applications to Agile. So a little bit about me. I started as a software developer many years ago. I did systems architecture. I did project management, program management. I ended up in QA almost by chance. I was headhunted when I was working for RIB, and I was headhunted by Telus to come to Vancouver for a QA role. I'd never done QA. I actually thought I wouldn't enjoy doing QA, and 7 years later I'm still doing it. And it's probably one of the most fulfilling and rewarding roles that I've had in my career. Like I mentioned, I worked abroad in Motorola. In Motorola, we did a lot of products. At the time, was product-based company, systems-based company. Then RIM, which is more of I worked in the devices group. So very, very product-centric. And then Telus, which is more of a service integrator. We don't ship products, we ship services to our clients. A little bit more interesting about me. There's a lot of things I like and a lot of things I don't like. I like skiing, I like rock climbing, I like biking, I play bridge, even though I'm still in my 30s. Not very good, so I have to learn a lot. And I hate cauliflower. I don't know why I have it there, but everybody has big pet peeve. And I hate driving. I love the public transit in Vancouver, so just a little bit about me. So hopefully it's clear enough. Maybe we can do this thing. What does Agile mean to all of you? Maybe we can start shouting some keywords and then we'll see if we hit some of them. So anybody? I heard Scrum somewhere. Scrum is there, yeah. Iterative. It's not there, but okay.
It's a methodology to adopt the methodology kind of thing. Say like Scrum and the other things are part of it.
So different methodology. Okay. Interaction with people, yeah. Okay, so I think you get it. I think we could be here for the next 2 hours and you'd be shouting different words, right? And that's what Agile means. It means something different to every single person. I'd say probably all of you will agree on 30% of the things, but I would say that a lot of the things are probably here. You may be doing in an organization, so the Toyota way you may have heard about. In the manufacturing world, it's an Agile principle. Yet does not apply really to software development, except some organizations are trying to do it. But my point is, Agile means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Keep that in mind when we talk about Agile testing. Because what I'm going to talk about is taking some of the things that are covered here and trying to implement it with our project. Now, why do large organizations want to do Agile? And we're not talking about testing just yet. We're talking just about changing. What's the number one reason? And I don't know if it's scientific evidence, but I've talked to telcos in North America, in Europe, in Australia, retail companies, product companies, and they all pick this one as the number one reason. So there must be some scientific evidence, but don't quote me. I don't work for Gartner or anything. So, anyone? You win. I call it velocity, but she said change quickly. Every single one is pretty funny. This was not a trick question or anything like that. Velocity is the number one that comes up. And it's really important if you are rolling out Agile to an organization, whether it's Agile development or testing, that's the number one metric that you need to track and figure out a way to track velocity. With your business stakeholders, with your CIO, velocity is a thing. Nothing else matters if what you're doing does not accomplish higher velocity. What do you think is number two? Wow, look at that. Did you read the deck beforehand? So you're meeting with the CIO, say, that's great, you're fast, but you really suck at it, right? So quality, that's the number two. Now 3 and 4, they get a bit more complicated, so I'll help you with that. How we interact, IT people, with the business. A lot of times I hear, oh my God, those business requirements take so long to create, and then those FRs, and it takes us 400 days to take a project from concept to production, and out of those 400 days, we spend 300 days debating with the business guys what we're gonna do, 5 days coding, and the rest of the time finding defects, right? So that's kind of what waterfall is about. So the interaction between IT and business keeps coming up. And a lot of organizations I talk to, all they've tackled is IT and business interactions, and they've done nothing else, and they've done Agile. That's why it's important to talk about Agile means different things to everybody, because some IT organizations will talk about continuous integration, continuous delivery, but many of the ones that start, that's the first thing they tackle. And it's one of the ones that is most difficult to tackle because it's easy to change how we operate. It's harder to change how others operate around us. And it's very difficult to change how the business operates around us. I'll talk a little bit more about how to do it and how we've been successful in areas that tell us where we did it, but it's one of the most difficult things to do. And finally, portfolio management. A lot of organizations say it's really chaotic. It's difficult to manage all the requirements we get. So Agile allows us to have a much better handle in the funnel of requests and things we have to do. I think for all of us in the room, I'd say what you need to worry the most about is number one, is velocity. And where you'll have the most work to do is how you interact with your business stakeholders, which is number 3. Number 4 is for your CIO and for your project managers or product owners. The concept of project managers are changing in the case of Agile. And like I said, going back, number 3 will probably be one of the hardest. I'll get into testing, don't worry. This is not just fluff. We'll get into testing for real. So what have we seen at Telus that have been the biggest impediments towards Agile? I could put a big long list there, but I picked 9 things that I think are pretty important. I'd say culture is the biggest one. And what do I mean by that? Everybody wants to be fast, but changing how you work, the behavior, is very difficult. If people are trained to do something in a certain way, it's very difficult to change how they work. The reason why Agile becomes difficult in large organizations is because a lot of people that know Agile came from smaller organizations. And they don't always understand why waterfall was in place in the first place. And they can't train and educate others on how to take waterfall and move it to Agile. And then you take the waterfall specialist and they'll say, but I don't believe Agile really works, right? So there's reluctance from both sides to work together. And when I talk to other organizations that have done Agile, they say that's been one of the most difficult things to do, is to Agile guys to understand waterfall to understand Agile, and then all of them to work together. I talk a little bit later about how to work around that issue a little bit. Technical debt. The most technical debt you have in an application. If your application is not following standards and frameworks and you haven't refactored along the way, I guarantee you it's going to be difficult to do Agile. Your automation is going to be very difficult. Service virtualization is going to be very difficult. So I talk a little bit about later, how do you tackle some of that technical debt kind of stuff. application architecture, how things are designed, how things are integrated, how complex they are. If you have Java talking to C, how many frameworks you use plays a big part into that. Oh, let's let them go. Tools, I wouldn't say it's the most critical one, but you will need some tools if you want to truly implement Agile. Lack of funding, you need to invest money, take it, believe it or not, and you'll get slower, and you'll throw people at it before you get faster. Executive buy-in, they like waterfall, let's just admit it. It's easy to understand, it's easy to explain. They say they buy in, but they don't always sell it to the rest of the organization how important it is to do. Lack of competition in the marketplace. I guarantee you, if you're the only one in the marketplace, velocity is not that important to you. So you're not going to do it, let's just be clear. So anybody here that doesn't have competition, I'll tell you, stay waterfall. Don't bother. Life is easier that way. If you have competition, I guarantee you'll become more important. Unskilled resources. Many folks don't understand what Agile is about. And for those of you in the room here, if you're testers, I tell you this, learn how Java works. Learn performance engineering tools. Learn about non-functional requirements, because, and I don't mean to offend anybody, if all you're able to do at this point, and hopefully that's not the case, is take functional requirements and translate it into test cases, I'm afraid you could be out of a job within the next 10 years. And Agile is not for you. So learn, research, develop. You don't need to be coders. You don't need to learn how to do that. But you need to understand a little bit better how the development world works. Finally, this has been the biggest pain point for us, test data and test environments. And I think all of you will see. The ideal scenario is we have virtual environments. You can get the developers to create their environments on their machines. I'll talk about some of the tools that we've used to kind of work around some of those challenges, and then test data. Test data for us is very difficult. When we test something, we have to integrate, say, 20 applications. So we try to subset from production. We then have to cross-reference all that data and then test. Very difficult to do. I'll talk again about a little bit about how we tackle that. So here's where it starts getting more interesting. So you go to work and say, okay, I want to start transforming waterfall into Agile. So where do I start? What do I do first? What's the easiest thing? So the first thing I'd recommend is select the teams very carefully. Don't think that everything can go Agile. Think about the projects we do, think about the teams. And if you work on multiple teams, here's where I would start. If it's standalone, you can do it fairly easily. And if it's new and standalone, even easier. So I'll give you an example. Portals was one of the first places we did. And we did the portal UI, which was completely decoupled from everything else. So you don't have to worry about dependencies. You don't have to worry about big data, 5 applications talking to each other. Every organization I talked to a major carrier in Australia. That's exactly how they started. And I'll show you all of those. From left to right until you get to yellow is about 2 years. We talk about a large organization. If you're a small place, a small organization, maybe not as long, but this large telco that I talked about, standalone was very easy. They did pilots. Within 3 months, they're doing Agile. They were Gango on that. They were going hard. Then said, wow, we're going to sell it to everybody in the organization. Then they moved to the next screen, integrated but new. They were able to do it, and they're there in about 12 months. And then they started implementing release trains and so on. I think I can mention the name Disney is doing a lot of Agile. If you go to a Disney park and look at some of the cool stuff they're doing, they're developing using Agile, and they're using Agile testing. A lot of it falls into this category over here, and it's taken them about 1.5 years to get there. Then we get into the yellow box. It's old, it's integrated by recent technology. That's the 2-year mark. That's what we've seen. That's the harder stuff. So whatever you do, don't start there. I'd say start standalone, learn how to do, and then move from left to right. And finally, do not even bother touching legacy. Don't even try it. Just let it die. Retire the system, replace it, do whatever you want to do, virtualize it, ignore it, but do not touch it. It's not worth trying. We've tried it several times, we've failed it every single time. And I've talked to organizations that have a lot of mainframe, and they say, we will not touch it. Just leave it alone. Did I make a point clear there? Yeah, okay. So what you'll find is there's not a single organization I've talked with, or a CIO or director that said our entire organization is doing Agile. Everyone says we started, we have a certain percentage of projects and teams and applications that are doing it. Varies between 20% to 60%, but they are not all at 100%, except that's going to be the reality. If you get about 20% of your applications in about a year to a year and a half, you're probably doing really well. Okay? Questions so far? So you know how to select it, you know how to go about it. I'm sure you can think about in your own work, what are the things that qualify and what are the things that don't qualify for Agile, at least from what we've learned. Wow, I can't read this crap. All right, I'll talk about it. There's 3 pillars that I want to. I want you to all consider when you leave here and you want to roll out Agile. I want you to think about tools. I want you to think about resourcing, and I want you to think about standards and processes. There's nothing else. Everything else fits into that. The deck will be sent out later on. Is that right? I assume. I'll just say yes. So the deck. Will you send the deck later on to everybody? Okay. So I'll explain what the colors mean, and I'll talk to you a little about. Green is pretty important. You need to do it. If it has a little star there, it says pay special attention to that. And if it's yellow, you can probably live without it, right? So that's how it is. Tools. My first recommendation is do not waste time trying to select the perfect tool. There's no such thing as perfect tool. So you'll have, if you're going into Agile, you'll have to figure out, do I get rid of HP Quality Center or do I use Jira? If I'm going to use automation, do I use Selenium or Thucydides, whatever? What I say is don't fret over that level of detail. You can modify HP Quality Center, even if you don't have ALM, to work in an Agile environment. If you don't have a tool, you can use Jira as an example, and Confluence, whatever they call it right now. They change the names. But what I'm saying is focus on the process and the templates. Don't focus too much on the tools. And I don't know if there's any tools guys that are here in the room.
Quick comment. What he's saying is only HPALM will get you to Agile.
Yeah. What I'm saying, HPALM is one of several options. And don't waste too much time. Focus more on the process than the tool. In terms of the tools that I'd say are absolutely critical for Agile transformation, automation. You need to pick an automation tool, and you need to pick a framework. At Telus, we are using a number of tools, depending on the uses. So we use Selenium as an example. We use Thucydides. We use frameworks around that. Those are open source and free. I'm sure HP likes that. But we also use HP QTP for a lot of our UI-driven tests. What I would do, and what we've done at Telus, is define where you want to do automation. So if you want to do unit testing automation, which I recommend you need to do, then you think, what's the best tool and the best framework? Selenium. Okay, don't waste any more time, move on. If you need to do regression, testing, UI-driven, and you've got QTP licenses, define it, standardize, and use it. That's what I'm saying. So you don't have just one tool, you could have 2 or 3. I will say you probably won't even find one tool that covers everything. The second thing around tools is you need to have tools to manage your test cases. You need to have tools to manage your defect management. We use Quality Center at Telus. We use also Jira. And I'm sorry, I need to talk about the differences between the two. We use Jira as well, yes. It's not for test, sorry, not for test cases. We use it for user stories and defect management. We use Quality Center. Okay. So there's an example where we use both tools. The reason why we use Jira, just for your interest, is the development teams, when they started doing Agile development, they started using Jira and using it for their user stories capturing. So we decided, okay, there's some benefit in linking what they're doing with what we're going to do in testing. So we're going to leverage that. But if you don't have Jira, you don't need Jira. You can load your user stories in Quality Center. You can load your test cases in Quality Center. You can load your defects in Quality Center. All I'm saying is how we use and why we did it. I'd say there you can probably just pick one tool and stick with it. If your organization has one tool, use it. The third tool or set of tools I believe are very important are code profiling tools. In Agile, it's really important to understand in a very programmatic way, in a very automated way, is the code ready to move on to the next stage? If you work in waterfall, a lot of times you have this entry criteria. The development guys will say, yes, I've completed all the early integration test cases and I've got 100% pass rate. What they don't tell you is what is the coverage of the testing that they've done. Did they cover it 80%, 100%, 10%? It's hard to audit, right? So with code profiling tools, like we use Sonar as an example, you can get reporting on how much unit test coverage you got. You can get report on the pass rates on that. You can get code profiling on are they using the right level of frameworks in that. And we're going to use that in an automated way to decide, does this code get promoted to release or not? So it's no longer a human decision. It's no longer my decision or my team's decision. It becomes a tool decision. You either meet the criteria or you're not. It's that black and white. Okay? Is anyone here using Sonar? Yeah. So, very, very useful. Now, you can use Sonar. You're probably sitting here, but wait, Hugo, you don't need to do Agile to use Sonar. You can use it in Waterfall. In fact, I do Waterfall. You're absolutely right. What we find is a lot of these principles blending really well into Agile. We had to use the terms Agile and use transformation to get people to use it. So you might find reluctance to do it in Waterfall, while in Agile you're going to use it as an opportunity to change how people really work. Yes?
For many of our customers, we use testing for test case management, combined with Jira for all the different. We also have the projects where it is testing and VanQA. So there are many multiple permission combinations that you can in terms of tool selections, but as you rightly mentioned, the process and the tools that defines the report that comes out of the tools defines the next steps.
And most, if you ever work with, I don't know, I'm going to pick Optimos or Accenture, IBM or Ericsson, you name it, they all use to each one of these tools. So you don't have to feel that when they come into your organization, they're going to dictate a tool on you. Most of the time, the tools don't matter for these guys. So I cover that on there. So on the resourcing side, sorry?
You talk about code coverage. Do you have like any threshold that you use to like say you're going to move to the next level or not?
Yeah, we do. We have defined some thresholds. So obviously 100% execution of your scenarios. We have 100% of unit testing automation. We have 80% code coverage. So those are the thresholds we set. Now, they're fairly new thresholds and we're playing with it a little bit. We're trying to figure out, is 80 good enough? Is it 85? So I have to admit, we're not that experienced using Sonar and these tools. So we're learning as we go along. For my previous roles, we use other tools and we kind of found that anything above 80% coverage was really difficult to accomplish. So that's kind of where we started. On the resourcing side, just a couple of things. We found really beneficial to have what we call one test architect that owns all testing. So unlike Waterfall, where you have a development team that'll do some testing, then you might have an early integration team, depending on the organization, and then you have a testing team, a product testing team, and you have different test strategies sometime, or different test plans, whatever you call it, and then different leads. We found that we needed one test design architect that covered the entire thing. So this architect is usually shared across multiple teams. Is an onshore-based resource. And his focus is on frameworks, standards, when we're doing automation, how much automation we expect to accomplish. When we're breaking out, and we'll talk about different phases we use for our Agile projects, when we break out the testing where it happens, what's the right level of breakdown? And he provides a lot of coaching and mentoring to the development teams even, or especially early on how to do their unit testing. So very important we found, and I talked to other organizations done exactly the same thing. The test design architect role spans across every single organization, development all the way to the business doing user acceptance testing, okay? I'd say it's probably the most important thing we found in how we organize the teams, just to be clear. Another thing some people talk about is when you do Agile testing, you have to have everybody co-located and everybody must be onshore. That is not true. If you're a large organization, that's not going to happen. No CIO will say, yeah, take your 200 people offshore and bring them all onshore and pay 4 times the price you pay. It's not going to happen. You can forget that. So we we've been very disciplined around what's onshore, what's offshore, and then we use something called nearshore. So we have folks that play certain roles onshore, and I'll have a slide that talks about that. We have folks that play roles in nearshore locations. Mexico is a good example. Then we have folks that are offshore. So you can absolutely do this with a large offshore team. And then you probably the next question is, so Hugo, what's the percentage of people onshore versus offshore? We run a ratio of about 85-15. So 15% of people onshore, 85 offshore. So you can hit a fairly large offshore ratio, even in Agile. I believe in a central independent testing team as well. Now, I'm going to be careful how I say that. I'll talk about how we break into phases in the testing, yes?
I have a quick question. Do you keep the same expectations from offshore, onshore, nearshore in terms of what your key metrics?
Yeah, the key metrics are the same. The skill sets are different.
So do you set the same expectations for all?
Well, I mean, each one will have different roles, but how we measure it, we measure everything the same way. And the key measure we use is velocity. Because by measuring, we use measures for velocity. By measuring that, we ensure that we have the best, most optimum handoffs between onshore and offshore. And actually, we use Quality Center to manage the handoffs onshore and offshore. It's a workflow engine, so we just use it to allocate work. And development teams use Jira when they're not co-located to manage some of that. So centralized independent testing, what do I mean by that? If you're a small application, let's try this. If you're a small application and you're like 20 people or something, you're not talking to anybody else, you have everybody on shore, you absolutely makes complete sense to have everybody co-located in a team. And a lot of people that have started looking at Scrum think of Agile as everybody has to be part of that Scrum team. Okay? That works really well with a small team. It does not scale well to programs where we have 200 people on a program. It's just not going to work. You cannot have 200 people in the room. So what you're going to have, you're still going to have a set of roles that are going to be located onshore. You're still going to have a Scrum teams. And I'll talk about how you organize those Scrum teams in a second. But then you're going to have a centralized team offshore. Because the way to think about it is this way. The bigger the work, the more you want to build a factory that you can scale up and down and move resources across. And in small teams, you don't need to do that, and it becomes difficult to do. In large teams, it's easy to do that. So we transfer a lot of our resources from team to team to team, depending on the workload, because we have 250 people offshore. It's as simple as that. So if you went and split those 250 people and put them with development and put them in Scrum teams, those 250 people would probably mean 400 people. And then you started wondering, oh, I don't have work for this guy doesn't have the right skill set to be on the other team. I'm sure you've seen it all. You have people that you don't have work for, and you don't have work for some teams. So anyway, standards and process talked about code coverage. It actually talks about the 80%. Talked about the regression level of automation we do there. And I talked about environments and data. So for environments and data, here's what we're doing right now. Development tests in their local machines, and we've given them tools to allow them to test. We believe in service virtualization. There's a bunch of applications. HPE has service virtualization. We use CA Lisa, and what it does, if you're a developer, you can virtualize all the services around the application you're trying to test. Some of you will say, well, isn't that the same as stubbing? No, it's not. Generally, a stub for a developer, it replicates one state of a state machine, or maybe two states of a state machine. And it's just another application you need to maintain. With service virtualization, what you do, there's multiple ways to virtualize services. But a very standard way to do it is you take an application A, talking to an application B, put a recorder in the middle, it records the traffic, and then it builds a profile of another application on the other side. So when we test, for example, we use about 150 services that we virtualize at any one time. We virtualize all the mainframe. Mainframe is never changing. I don't even test with mainframe. I virtualize it and I close it, that's it. When we do credit card checks, as an example, so Telus, when you call in and provide a new service, credit card checking is a big thing. So we do service virtualization where we virtualize the interface to global payments and so on, whatever we use for our Equifax and so on. So those are good examples. We do development with Best Buy. So if you go to Best Buy, you can buy a cell phone and from Telus, and there's a system that they'll use. They'll talk to our systems to provision, activate phones. When Best Buy tests their changes, they're testing against virtual services in our data centers. They do not test against a real live application. And the great thing is we can put the service up there and running, and that's it. Training is another example. Yes?
How about the data you put into the virtual service?
Absolutely.
How do you synchronize all the developers' data? Do you centralize them or?
Yeah, so we have centralized data. So we'll get into so data. What we're doing right now, we just started, and Agile kind of pushed us that way. We used to do all database manually created. We wrote automated scripts that would create customers and so on. We're actually starting to now subset and anonymize all data from production. We're using something called Grid Tools. Grid Tools is, you may have heard of IBM Optim, or Informatica has their own solution. It's a tool that allows you to plug into a database in production, subset the data, and then maintain referential integrity between the different data sources in the database. So, and then it maintains what we call the baseline. So when I say, I need 3 customers that have telephone lines associated with them in my test environment to test, I go to Grid Tools, I pull those 3 customers, and Grid Tools then takes data from production, anonymizes, and then pushes to our environments to the exact. So if there's 3 databases, pushes to the 3 databases in our environments. So it's a multi-year project. Grid Tools licenses are generally expensive. I don't know if HP has something like that. But yeah, you're part. There you go. So you probably know what I'm talking about. So we use Grid Tools. I personally am biased towards Grid Tools. When Grid Tools was created intentionally to address a test data management challenge. While tools like IBM, Optim, and Informatica, ETL, and so on, they were created as SBI data analysis tools. And then they realized, oh, we have a data opportunity, we're gonna adapt it. So that's why I prefer Grid Tools in our case. Questions so far? I could talk about this for the next 10 hours, so as you can see. Is it interesting so far? Have I lost anybody yet? No?
Do you do virtualization just for functional testing or performance also?
We absolutely do for both. It is really important for performance testing. Good question. Did everybody kind of get what service virtualization meant, what I meant by that? Okay, so let me give you an example. When I do performance testing, I have this staging environment, right? And when I put an order in Wireline, and I'm looking for a telephone number. So the first stage in the order is, let's make sure, what telephone numbers can we allocate to this customer? So I know you, Anna, right? You call Telus and say, I'd like you to provide me a telephone number. And the agent says, oh, I know, whatever. Starts entering the system. It actually goes into mainframe and says, Anna is living in this location. What telephone numbers do you have available in here? Right? You still with me? Makes sense? Okay. So that never changed. That functionality has been in place for the last 100 years, whatever that is, right? So if I do performance testing, now imagine a nightmare here. I have to have all the data that you're talking about in mainframe. I have to have it all synchronized. Performance testing consumes data like crazy. It's like a fire hose out of a fire truck when you're doing performance testing. And then you don't need mainframe. You need to keep it up. You need to get that response, but it's not changing. So what I do is I basically stub mainframe. I don't like to use the term because it's not exact stub. So I put a recorder between mainframe and the systems that talk up, listen to the traffic, recorded all the use case around telephone numbers, and then I switch off the mainframe and I put this virtual server in place that then does it. Now, why is that important for performance testing? With performance testing, a lot of the stuff that we do is changing the behavior of the applications to test resiliency. So, by that I mean, so if for example you have a response time of 10 milliseconds, actually I'll give you another example. We moved applications from a data center out in the west to a data center in the east. Not a big deal. You get a 70 millisecond delay across the country. You think, no big deal. HP will say we use genre tools and said, yeah, I get that. So that's okay, 70 milliseconds, no big deal. If an application isn't chatty, if an application is very chatty, then 70 milliseconds times 100 transactions, do the math. It's not looking very good. So what we can do is we can put a virtual service and then we can throttle up or down the response times of that to mimic that response time. So we use virtual services in performance testing, a lot for negative testing, to see what if I now only have 2 nodes instead of 3? What if I now bombard this application with transactions every 5 milliseconds as opposed to 20 milliseconds? Do they survive? So that's why we use it in performance testing. And I can tell you this, since we started using, we have not had a single performance defect in production in the last 12 months. And another thing of Agile I was going to forget. Waterfall spends too much time testing functional requirements. That's the easy stuff. That's easy to implement. Come on, like, I mean, it takes a blind developer to not know what the functional requirements are. It's in front of them. With Agile, you need to spend time focusing on all these ilities, as I call it. Resiliency, scalability, capacity, performance. So that's why these tools are important. That's why I talk quite passionately about this, as opposed to how do I map functional requirements into test case and then execute. Okay? Anything else I need to cover there? No, I think I covered everything. Any questions? How am I doing for time? It's good? Okay. Oh, Agile testing doesn't mean free-for-all. Really important thing. As soon as you start doing Agile testing, someone will say, I read in the book that you want to leave it to the development teams and the testing teams when they work together to define what the processes are and the tools. So if I want to use Selenium here, I'm okay. And if that guy wants to use QTP over there, he's okay. I usually swear when I hear that, and I say a model like that does not scale well to a large organization. There has to be standards and frameworks you adopt. So here's my feedback. Pick a tool, pick a standard, pick a process, and say everybody should follow this. Now don't pick a lot, pick 10 things at most. Still give freedom to the development teams and the testers and so on to do what they need to do in their Scrum. But certain things are not negotiable. Otherwise, Agile becomes fragile. And we've seen that a lot as well. And he failed at Telus because he was not Agile, was fragile, and it wouldn't get anywhere. So pick some standards, don't pick too many, define them and say, look, you have to use those. No matter what you do, code coverage has to be 80% or I will not take your code. How you test, what color font you use, I don't care. But you gotta get 80% coverage. It's an example of a standard that we do not compromise, right? So if you're a small team and the standalone, maybe you can compromise on that. Then it doesn't matter as much. But if you want to do in a large organization scale and then you buy ALM licenses, but then some other part organization buys IBM licenses, can you imagine even just the cost of that? So, okay? You got what I mean? Cool. So how to build a testing organization. So this applies if you work with onshore and offshore. I don't know here who uses offshore, so I thought I'd put it here. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 roles that I consider important if you are in a testing organization. So I talked about the technical test design architect, so I don't need to go there anymore. Then you have a senior tester. That's usually your test lead. We find York's best if that person is at least near shore, so we use Mexico as an example. Usually dedicated to a team. Why we pick Mexico? He can still be part, or he or she can be part of the Scrum teams, and you can take advantage of the lower cost, because Mexico will be cheaper than someone in Canada. There's places in the US. We've also used nearshore in Halifax. So if you work in a large organization, have the ability to leverage other teams. Let's say you go, let's pick Optimus here, right? So we want to build an Agile testing team. Because you're smart and you've read some books and you test some stuff. You've got to say, you know what? I'd like onshore, nearshore, and offshore, and explain that to them. And they could figure out whether it's Halifax or I think New Jersey at some places and so on. In the same time zone at a lower cost. That's what that means. Okay? Then I believe you should have a performance engineer and the performance tester dedicated to each of the Scrum teams. A performance engineer and a performance tester are two different things. We have both roles. A performance engineer is someone that we use to, does two things, defines non-functional requirements, does a lot of production scrubbing. They go to production, run logs in production to understand, if you're doing performance testing, what are the SLAs based on how things work in production? A performance testing, that test is usually a scripter. He's the guy that will run, say, create and run load runner scripts. So the tester can be offshore. The performance engineer has to at least be near shore. A performance engineer generally has knowledge of middleware. So if you are an Oracle shop and use WebLogic, if you are IBM shop and you use WebSphere, they should understand how those work. A performance engineer generally in the previous life was a Java developer if you're using Java. Often they know databases really well. They're not database architects, they're not database analysts, but they understand the basic concept of database. They're very difficult to find and they're very expensive as well. And they're probably the most critical role that I have in my team. They contribute to the success of the work that we've done over the last 2 years to reduce the number of performance defects. Okay? Then we've got test data managers. The model is pretty straightforward there. You've got one lead onshore that covers all of it, and then the rest of everybody can be offshore. You need to create that subsetting that I'm talking about. You need to create a baseline, whether you do it manually or not, but then the management and update of that can happen from offshore very easily. So, like I said, 85-15, that's kind of our breakdown for our resources. Cost-wise, the technical test design architect's your most expensive resource. Maybe even the performance engineer will be more expensive than the guy like that. And you'll find a technical test design architect often was a developer at one point, was an automation specialist, and he's very passionate about coding. You do not take a plain old functional requirements tester and turn it into a test design architect. Very difficult to do that. Okay, questions so far in terms of the roles and what we do, how we use them? Yeah?
The question I have is basically when you have an offshore team that is doing the testing, and you have an onshore team which is doing the development, and there is no time management. So how does they communicate? Like suppose they found a bug which development team has to fix on the onshore. How does they really communicate? And how is basically saying you can use the way to reproduce it, and this is how we found it.
Okay. So that's a very good question. That's been a challenge that we've had in the past. Many organizations that I talk to have development teams with support people also offshore that they can answer and address the defects that you're talking about. We don't have that today in all the places. So what we do right now is we have overlapping hours between India, our nearshore location, and here. So for example, I'll give you an example. There's a 12-hour time difference between Vancouver and Bangalore, where we have the folks. So what we generally do is we have them come into the office at 10, 11, 12 o'clock, and then we have them work until 8, 9, or 10 o'clock at night to allow for it to overlap. There'll be a period of time in India where they do not have any support. They're on their own. So yeah, if they find a critical defect, they're going to have to wait. Like I said, the only way to fix it is to have presence offshore. So, and as you do more and more agile teams, actually I was talking to a bank in the US, their Scrum teams in some cases are located in India. They're starting to move like the Scrum teams, the development as well to India. So that would work as well. So very good question.
Can I add to this?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, to answer, elaborate more on that, what we also practice when we are logging those defects, we put down all the steps that we have gone through in order to reproduce those defects. That's one. Secondly, we add screenshots to those tickets. And third thing is, let's say it's a very complex thing, then we can create a video and upload it to the ticket. This is how we make sure that the defects are identified for the developer if the developer is on site and the tester is off.
So we do a lot of the stuff that he just described there. We don't use videos, but we do record steps. And the reason why we do that as well is because of SOX requirements we have. We need to track that information. So, yes?
I just want to let you know, talk about a little this issue like as well. Like I've been working in an offshore Agile team as well. And there used to be like daily meeting as such in which all the Scrum members together for some time, like 10-15 minutes, and put on like if there is anything critical they have found as a tester, they tell about that to the team as well. They disclose it during that meeting. That happens daily in daily call.
So someone was talking about the daily calls and using offshore. So I'll tell you how we do it. We do something similar, but not exactly. Because we use nearshore, the nearshore guys, their role is to do the understand what happened offshore, and then do the handoff to the Scrum team. The nearshore guys are part of the Scrum team. So we can let the guys in India sleep, so they don't have to be on these calls. At least once a week we do calls with them. It's important to keep them. So Wednesday mornings, I think 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning, we have calls with them. We also did, and if you've worked with India, one thing you need to do is set boundaries. If you say they can call you, they'll call you at any time, doesn't matter what. Because they also expect if you have a problem, you can call them any time. So we had to set boundaries and say, you can call me for 15 minutes between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock at night. Otherwise, you have to figure it out. So we set boundaries. We used SharePoint and Wiki pages. I know you're laughing, but we had to do it. I'm sorry. They were calling me sometimes at 11 o'clock. Like, I need to log my time in this system. You know, we use something called eTime at Telus that tracks people's time to projects. Like, I'm having a problem. I don't know my code. I'm like, it's 11 o'clock. I go to bed at 9:30, right? So come on, like, just give me a break. So we had to set some boundaries here. But yeah, we've done some of that, but we leveraged nearshore. And I think the easiest thing for you guys to do if you are rolling out Agile to large organization, don't just do offshore, onshore, do offshore, nearshore, and onshore, and then leverage it that way. The follow the sun model. Yes, back there?
How do you get people to multi-potential space Agile stand-ups in the morning? Because it's not morning for them, so you can't set up goals and
So in our case, the stand-up meetings only include East and West. We have folks in Toronto, folks in Ottawa, folks in Vancouver, so that's only 3 hours, it's easy. And then the nearshore guys, which are in Mexico. We don't include the folks from India in the stand-up meetings. Sometimes they attend because they want to know. So that's how we address it. So a 3-hour time zone is pretty easy.
Can I address the India thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
You want the microphone?
Oh, no. Okay, sure.
Or you can shout.
Hello. Yeah, so in our case, what we do, our team in India, they start late. So they come around, say, 11 o'clock their time. That means by the time we are already speaking. So they stay late in their office. So morning time, our time, which is say 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, they are available to do the scrum calls. So because what happens, say, let's say 7:30 or 8 o'clock, you are doing a scrum call, and still if there are certain things that followed up after the scrum call that a tester has to do who is in India, he or she can do, say, till 11:30, 12 o'clock there, because they are starting late. So we are using the benefit of they're coming late and leaving late for home.
So maybe I'll say one thing just so that I think it's clear. If you are doing Agile development and testing, and everybody's co-located, and you're doing a Scrum team, so let's say you're an organization of 50 people, that's how you would do it. You wouldn't leverage offshore. You will get more velocity than what I get. I guarantee you that. Like I'm not trying to advocate that the model that I have achieves a maximum perfection in terms of velocity. It's better than waterfall. That's what it is. And there's many other things that we do that give you, with service virtualization and testing and so on, that give you other benefits. But you will never be as fast as, say, a 20-person software development organization. I guarantee you that. So don't even try to go there. So the comment about India, just accept, it will be inefficient in some times. But the reality is, a resource in India can cost per hour $20-something, right? A tester. Even less, with the rupee now, especially against Canadian dollar. You take a local person in Vancouver, that costs $70-something an hour. So you know what? If you're losing 15% productivity, but it's like a third of the cost, then it's fine. Okay? This is the model we use right now, and I didn't put a lot of details, but I just wanted to show you how we use different Scrum teams, and I've seen sort of variations of this. So I'll explain. Maybe I'll use a little pointer now. Which one is that? The little left one? Okay. So we have a number of Scrum teams. Doesn't matter how many, right? they do their unit test, they do their development, they do their unit testing. Unit testing is done by the development folks. Like I said, we have a test designer architect that works with them to set the standards and the frameworks and understand what's going on. We use, I don't know, Maven, so even help set some of those things up. But they do their little sprints, they do their scrums, and and then different scrum teams will bring the code together, will integrate, and then to do something what we call solutions code. So you'll take 2 or 3 scrum teams that will create something I just call it a solution. It's a solution to a problem, right? That's all it is. And it will make sense when I get down. Then once they have all these scrum teams that have integrated and have these solutions and so on, all of this is done in local machines, local services, virtual services. Like it's pretty straightforward. Then we promote the code into what we call the user stories testing. Now we start looking. So at the top there, you're talking about technical requirements, you're talking about wireframes and so on. You're talking actual user stories. And then there it depends. Some models development does the testing, some model it's then the independent team that starts testing. Over here you're looking at least 80% code coverage before they get promoted. You're looking at close to 100% automation, that kind of stuff that I talked about. Then it goes into systems testing, which is, okay, I start testing based on user stories. Am I ready to promote this to the next set of environments where you now start looking at it more as features and as applications, right? So, and there's like test environments, and they move across quite quickly and quite easily. It's not a big deal, but you start, how can I put it? In waterfall, this is usually what development does over here, and this is what they do when they start integrating new development, early integration, and so on. Then we go into system integration testing. And often what we do system integration testing is when we then start merging your changes that are of the Agile projects with the release streams and the release code that you have from other waterfall stuff. So now you start playing this, there's waterfall stuff happening here as well. And finally, you go into your last cycle, which is your performance and hardening and integration, testing and UAT. And there you're looking at end-to-end business transactions. Most of your functional testing happens here. So by the time you get here, very little functional testing anymore. So by the time you get here, the code is near perfect. And now you're looking for, does it meet the basic business scenarios? We do operational readiness testing. If the business teams comes in and we use something like Thucydides and do user-based automated testing, that's where that happens. Resiliency, capacity, and so on. Now you're looking at this and say, wow, this is worse than waterfall. There's more phase than anything else. I just wanted to break it out more based on different levels of how you test as opposed to stages. These are not stages. This happens, this code here, this cycle happens every day. We've got multiple promotions here, sometimes 10 to 15 a day. This happens at least once a day. This happens often, even here, once a day or once every 2 days. And this cycle is 10 days. So this entire thing here could be 15 days at most. Okay? Then this is where we release to production, or may not release to production. This is what we have, what we call releasable code. The important distinction with Agile is you don't need to be releasing every time to production. You just need to have code that is good enough and fit to go to production. We may release it, we may use feature flags, we may do whatever that is. So you may still only release every 3 months if that's what your release cycle is about. So for example, we have major release every 3 months, we have minor release every month. So you may do this in you've got your 2-week scrums, you've got your hardening cycles. You may have code that you can put in production really literally every 2 weeks, because when you're hardening here, by the way, you're already on to the next scrum, right? So it's not sequential, right? It's more parallel than anything. So that's the model we use. Every organization that I've talked to uses variations of this. The thing that tends to happen the most is usually you've got this functional focused stage, and then you've got this release integration hardening stage. That's the only thing I'd say. So working with the test design architect, they may change this a little bit. You may decide to skip the solutions code phase. What I'm saying is this is just an example of how to think about how we move code across. Okay? I only have 10 things to wrap up, and just some thoughts to for all of you to take away when you go home. We talked about this. So these are probably the 10 things. If you don't remember anything, maybe if you can at least take some of these. Be very selective about the apps that you choose. We talked about that a lot. Set strong standards and processes. It's not a free-for-all, if you remember that comment that I made. One test architect owns all testing. What I mean by owns all testing, and careful with Agile, we are one team working together. It means that person needs to understand where testing starts and where testing finishes. Development may still be doing the testing, but that person understands it end to end. Very important. You automate as much of your processes as you can. So you don't want handoffs and going from stage to stage or from unit testing to whatever that is in a, hey, I think my code's ready. What do you think? Yeah, sure, give it to me, right? You want to, I talked about Sonar and some other tools. You want to use automated mechanisms to decide whether you're ready or not. Remove the human factor from that a little bit. Velocity is number one. It's like in finance, cash is king. In Agile, velocity is king, right? That's another way to look at it. Agile coaches, that's something I talked about. We use Agile coaches at Telus, and they were very helpful. There's folks that came from other organizations that have done Agile transformations. ThoughtWorks is an organization that's done it. EPAM is an organization that's done it. They have tremendous knowledge. What I will caution you is this. Many of them focus a lot on development, and they don't focus as much on testing. I haven't found a lot of coaches that fully understand what it takes to test in a large organization. Now, I met some that understand it really well, but not all do. When you find a coach, if you decide to go, and I give you a couple of names, EPAM and ThoughtWorks, and there's probably many others out there, is if you test focus, ask questions. I don't want to just development, I don't want to just do continuous integration, I want you to help me change how I test, okay? You still have to work with waterfall, like it or not. You still have to integrate it. Talked about that. I talked a little bit, move away from functional testing. You're not going to find bugs. That's for development teams. That's what you want to automate. Focus on performance engineering. That's where you're going to see the biggest benefit. It's a multi-year journey. I talk about how long it takes to get there, if you remember the 2-year comment that I made. And finally, use lessons learned. So what we've done, we did application area, the portal side. It went on for about 12 months. And we learned a lot from that. We used a lot of lessons learned, and we adjusted our way of working based on that. Right now, we have another 75 areas that we're doing it. Each one is doing it slightly different. So in one area, my team is not even involved in testing. We set the standards. We said, development, I want you to do it all. I want to see how that works. Try and see what works for your organization. What you'll find is you won't have one rule that applies to everybody. You want to have a set of standards that everybody follows. But how you organize teams, what I gave is a guidance and some experience around it, but try and adjust, okay? In Agile, it's super important to continue to evolve and change how you work. You want to learn more? I read some books before we started doing Agile at Telus. The main ones are How Google Tests Software. Some of you may have read. I'd say it's probably the most insightful book on testing software. It can get pretty dry. I get it. But if you can read it. It's worth the time. I have a lot of friends that work for Google, and I'm always fascinated about how they do software development. Agile Testing, a practical guide for testers and Agile teams. I don't know Lisa, but I know Janet, and Janet is actually, I think, from Calgary. She does Agile Testing coaching. She's not paying me to do this, but what I found is when I look for books on Agile Testing, and I look for people that focus on testing, hello? Yeah. She was one of the few that I encountered. So she's local, she's Canadian, she does consulting stuff, she does teaching. The book is pretty good, and it's focused just on testing. We leveraging a lot of Scale Agile framework concepts. We haven't started doing this. We're starting to implement something called release trains. In the portfolio management recommendations within Scale Agile framework, we're looking at that. There's the website. Agile Vancouver is running a session, I think in about a month. It's about, I don't know, $850 or something for 2 days. And you get to learn about Scaled Agile Framework. If you're in a large organization, you want to pick a framework that you're going to adopt, that's a good one. And I actually don't know any other framework really that comes close to that. Finally, when I started, the first book I read was by Jess, not Humbler, but Humble. He works for ThoughtWorks. He really is the father of continuous delivery. And the book is called Continuous Delivery. Again, I don't work with ThoughtWorks and they don't pay me, but if you've heard of Selenium, it came from ThoughtWorks. And many of the principles that are now utilized by development teams, and I say the Bible of continuous delivery was written by Jess Humble, who is with ThoughtWorks. So those are the books. I'd start probably, a good introduction is the Agile Testing if you're interested. I'd move to How Google Tests, and then maybe for your development teams, and maybe if you want to get into understanding the concepts of continuous delivery, which I didn't talk a lot about, because that's not what the topic was, then you get into Jess Humble stuff. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Yes.
So what I basically is curious to know is, as per you're running the sprints, and you have the developers working on a particular user story, and at the same time, most probably QA is doing something, right? Writing the test cases against that user story.
Right.
So if you're running a sprint of suppose 2 weeks, is there any like guidelines or you have set up as a process saying user stories need to be done by this time so that the QA can go and test those user stories before the end of the sprint so that we can mark them as done?
The user stories are developed before the sprint even starts, before the Scrum cycle even starts. They're usually done up front. One of the things that we're looking at right now is what I was talking about, the release trains. Is how do you develop user stories, plan your epics. So for example, the user stories that I was talking about is you need to coordinate the sequence of how you implement your user stories. Then eventually you need to make commitments to your business stakeholders when the entire functionality is going to be delivered to deploy a new project, whatever that is. So I'm going to tell you this. We're still playing around with the right time to write user stories. How we interact with, do we slow down the Scrum so we can write them in the beginning? When do we review with the business users? Do we write them too far in advance? So I'd say something we're still learning about, and then we're using, ideally, the Scaled Agile Framework and their methodology, where they do a lot of that work up front. What they do is, every 3 months, they do a very large 5-day planning session. They look at the user stories in the pipeline, and they prioritize it in the epics, and they target it for release, and then they work from that.
But I think this is kind of a grooming of an epic and making it a user story. But what I was trying to find out is basically when you have a user story, you give it to the developer. You say, okay, we are running for a 2-week sprint.
Right.
Okay, guys, go and start developing it. Okay, QA, go and start writing the test cases.
Right.
Most probably you have the situations where developers are like, okay, there are 2 days left into the finish of the sprint, and we are giving it to QA now. So in these kind of situations, do you guys have these kind of situations?
Actually, that's not how we do. In fact, we give it to QA after the sprint.
Oh, okay.
So the model I was talking about, I understand your question. The sprint that we have there, I had the first phase, which is the development unit, and then I had the second phase, which is the system integration, whatever I call it. Those are generally done by development. Okay? And then at the end of the 2 weeks, you've completed those first 2, and then you hand it over. So usually QA is somewhat out of pace with the development team, a little bit. And then QA goes into these system functional and hardening and so on. Does that make sense?
So is it like something like, suppose you have a 2-week sprint, I'm developing for 2 weeks.
Right.
And I have done something in 2 days. Right? So is it that story like the developer is sitting, or is the developer playing with it? It never goes to the
The developer will continue to develop more stories, they will continue to test, and then at the end of they'll promote their code locally, they might even promote it to the box where the QA guys are testing, but they won't pick that up until the sprint is over.
Okay, so are you saying if there's a bug found in that story, it comes back in the next sprint for the developer to go and fix it, and then they fix and give it back?
The bug that you're going to find at that point in the hardening cycle and so on is completely different than the bugs you're going to find in the Scrum. So Yeah, so if you're going to find bugs in the hardening cycle, which is the integration cycle and ready to release and so on, yeah, you're going to hand it back to the developer guys. They're going to fix it. And then it depends on whether they're going to fix it and promote it right away, or they're going to say, you know what, the next sprint, you'll have the bug fixes in there. It depends. Yeah?
How do you conduct retrospectives and how often?
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so we don't do too well. I'll start like that. So
What is distributed to?
yeah, so right now we're doing retrospectives at the beginning of each Scrum cycle, so every 2 weeks. And then we do them when we release to production. Those are the 2 times that we do. Where we say we don't do too well, and that's actually an area that we're addressing right now, is we don't do a good job at fully understanding how well we did, what we need to change, what's the root cause of things. So we spend a lot of time kind of whining and complaining and talking, but not enough time fully understanding what truly happened. So we're actually addressing that in terms of process. We're putting some tools in place. One of the things we're doing is we're actually setting up a database where once you do your retrospectives, you log the information so the teams can go in and say, oh, yeah, I see, when they use Sonar, this is what happened for the first time, right? So it's new. We used to do lessons learned in Waterfall at the end of a project, you know, after 400 days of doing it. And we haven't fully embraced the retrospective thing within Agile. Yep.
How have your test deliverables evolved using Agile? So do you still have a test strategy?
No.
You still have,
We don't have a test strategy.
maybe even for test cases, do you still have manual test cases?
We absolutely still have manual test cases. We don't have a test strategy per se. So we have, let me see if this makes sense. So each Agile team, so going back to standards, it's up to each team to define what they need. So if you are okay with the back of a napkin, you're okay with the back of the napkin, that's what we're going to do. If you need a test strategy, the team agrees that they need to do, that's fine. If they're going to test just based on wireframes, that's what they're going to do. So we don't define any documentation of any sort to the teams. What we define is this. I need to see 80% code coverage. I need to see 90% automation. I need to measure burn rates, like burn charts, and see the velocity. That's what we do. How you do it, I don't care. We still have him in Waterfall. And the reason why we have him in Waterfall is because you audit, it's easier to audit the process documents than it is to audit the software. In our case, we audit the software with automation. We don't care about that documentation.
But for audit purposes, then how do we back it up as far as audit tests, other than our test results? And are they linked to the sprint?
Right. So for audit purposes, and we've been audited several times, we've done SOX and all of that, they look at test cases, they look at test results. So those we maintain. So those are the only 2 things that we maintain. They've never asked and they've never looked at test strategies and so on. They looked at user stories, they looked at test cases, they looked at test results, but that's the extent of it.
Test results will be for each sprint.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. Yes?
So, from the testing perspective, and then you said it's all kind of automated for doing the test. So, how do you basically measure the scenario coverage or behavioral coverage of that particular application?
So, we're using right now Sonar. That's what we're using to track code coverage, as an example. We're using a tool I didn't talk about, but that's more around profiling of applications called Dynatrace. It's done by CompuWare. And those are the main ones. In the previous live, I used some IBM tools like the Rational Suite has also unit testing, code coverage, code profiling, memory leak, finders, and so on. So in our particular case, the tool we use to do framework checking, code coverage checking, and so on is Sonar.
And the other question is basically, if you are doing offshore unit testing,
Right?
so as I understand, it's basically when you have a user story coming into your sprint, you have some business analysts working, and the user story can evolve over the time.
Right.
So how does is it your business analysts are onshore, and how they communicate with the QA team, basically to say, okay.
That's correct.
right.
That's correct. It's through the onshore or nearshore that communication happens with the offshore team. Yeah. Wow. Someone's happy back there. Any other questions? How much time do you want to give?
I think we are over. No.
Yeah. How about this? One last question.
Last question, please.
One more question. In terms of the regression, how do you handle it, and at which point are you doing regression testing? At the hardening stage of the sprint?
That's right. We do it at hardening stage. I call it hardening or the integration stage. We have that automated as well. Not as easy to automate because a lot of that is end to end. We have about 40. The most you can get is about 30 to 40% because there's a lot of integration. But yeah, that's exactly what we do. That regression testing.
But you still have some manual tests that you need to perform as far as regression?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But those regression cycles are much shorter. So the assumption is when we get, so I'm going to go back. The assumption is when development teams are doing their development testing, they're continuously building automation for their unit testing. And they're continuously running it. And we monitor that because we have tools to verify that they actually do or not. So as we log bugs and they keep updating that and they keep updating the code coverage, our assumption, and this is how it is with Agile, is that you always have working code from then, and when the functional stuff is less of a concern. So when we get to the last stage, and I'll explain why it's different in Waterfall, your regression starts focusing on this integration, hardening, performance, scalability, and so on. You've got a 2-week cycle, some of it is automated. In Waterfall today, what tends to happen is I end up running multiple cycles of functional testing because when they're making changes, they start breaking other functionality, they don't have test harnesses to validate and automate and so on. So our regression cycles today in Waterfall could be, 6-7 weeks because they continue to break existing functionality as you're doing it. What we find with Agile, that doesn't happen as much. When we get the functionality, a lot of the functionality is broke. So your regression focuses at that point more so on where the key business processes, and I need to validate those key business processes are in place. I'm not validating that sprint number 1 brought functionality or sprint number 0, whatever that order is. Does that make sense? So your regression is a lot more condensed. I think that's it, right?
Yep.
Well, thank you. Thank you for great questions. Cheers. Here you go.
Thank you, Hugo.
Thanks.
I hope everyone have enjoyed this session. Lots
Thanks,
of
man.
questions and experience sharing from Telus. So our next meetup will be here itself, but it will be on the back side, near the fireside. And we will be doing a chat with the Recon Instrument Director of Development. And so feel free to send your questions in advance at my email address. These are the 2 open positions. As Hugo mentioned, that we are that now more and more testers should have some experience on Java. So you can see that the first posting that is there has a requirement on Java side. So these are the 2 positions that we are planning to fill soon. If you or your friends are interested or have the relevant experience, please feel free to share their resume with me. And thank you.
Yeah.
Ask you some more questions.
You can ask, yeah.